Today on BRStv, the two ions that make up more than 86% of what's in your salt bucket. Two major elements. Do you know what they are? Do they matter? And how to use this knowledge to evolve our tanks better, healthier growth, coloration, and reduce mortalities. Hey, this is Ryan with BRStv's Master Series, diving into that gap between good, great, and all the progress left on the table. Very few reefers have put much thought into the two most abundant ions in your salt bucket and in turn tank. Today, a deep dive into sodium and chlorine, or chloride. I guarantee you're going to walk away from this with a different perspective on how these two elements affect the success of your tank, but more importantly, how to find those incremental results and master major elements in your reef tank. I'm gonna be brave here and poke the bear a bit because the desire is to take what we've already learned, that type of progress, and then find the next evolution. Today's all about sodium and chlorine combined together, sodium chloride, and basically table salt. Chloride is the negatively charged form of chlorine, so note when you see chlorine mentioned in relation to ICP and other types of reef tank testing, it's probably easier to think of it as the chloride portion of sodium chloride. The most important thing to grasp is sodium chloride makes up roughly 86% of what's in your salt mix. A vast majority of what's in the bucket is sodium chloride salt. In fact, there's around 4 gallons of sodium chloride in your 5-gallon bucket of salt. Sodium and chloride ions are so abundant that as long as overall salinity is kept in check, it's very unlikely that either would be a limiting factor to coral or fish metabolic function. But there are two significant considerations with sodium chloride that I think every reefer should be aware of. First is elevated sodium chloride from dosing any type of 2-part. If you dose 2-part, you have this issue and may have been completely unaware. 2-part not only elevates salinity and sodium chloride concentrations, but will throw off the entire element balance of the tank. This is one of those things that happens slowly over time, and you may not even notice it's happening until you're trying to solve coral health issues related to seriously depleted minor and trace elements. As this series goes on, you'll see why that's a legit issue worth fixing, especially if it's low cost and easy. So here's the challenge. The calcium portion of every 2-part is just calcium chloride salt. When added to water, the calcium chloride ionizes and splits off and separates into calcium and chloride. Corals utilize the calcium, but leave that chloride behind to build up in the tank. The alkalinity portion of 2-part is always sodium-based, most commonly sodium carbonate or sodium bicarbonate. In this case, the sodium carbonate ionizes and splits when it hits the water. Corals utilize the carbonate or bicarbonate, and the sodium is left to build up with every single 2-part dose made to the tank. However, if you look at the net of all this, the sodium and chloride left over from that process is essentially the same as dosing sodium chloride salt to the tank every day, which is obviously going to increase salinity. In fact, if you take a 2-part dose, which is the equivalent of 1.5 DKH replacement, common to many SPS dominant tanks, the overall salinity of the tank may rise 50% over the year, meaning going from 35 parts per thousand to nearly 50, obviously a bad move for the tank. In a moment, I'm going to share a calculator where you can actually enter your tank size and dose to identify exactly what the salinity effect will be on your specific tank. But first, why are you not seeing this effect with your tank? The answer is water changes. Taking elevated salinity water out of the tank and replacing it with the right salinity as part of normal water changes corrects for this. For instance, a 10% weekly water change limits the yearly increase to about 2 parts per thousand from 35 to 37 in a year, and are not a difficult issue to deal with. Even 20% once a month water change limits the increase to 3.5 or 38.5 parts per thousand by the end of the year. So you can see even the most basic approaches to water changes has a significant mitigating effect on the increased sodium chloride and salinity. Regular water changes is how a vast majority of reefers in the past, including myself, have handled the excess sodium chloride. This is a good option, easy to understand and implement. Because of that, it also produces good results in our tanks. Okay, so what does great look like then? Well, that addresses a totally different problem. Let's say the excess sodium chloride that I'm adding raises the salinity to 38.5, or in my case, 3.5 parts per thousand too high. The solution to that is fairly simple. Remove 10% of the salt water from the tank and replace it with fresh water to dilute it back down. There's also a calculator for that I'll share in a moment as well. Diluting the higher salinity water back down seems simple enough and something that we've all done before, either in the tank or salt bin, but the difference between the tank and the saltwater mixing bin lies the difference. Presuming you're using a decent salt mix, in the salt bin, every element is starting at the proper ratio to each other, and they scale up and down proportionally. In this case, dilution with fresh water works well. However, in the tank, if the excess sodium and chloride that you've been dosing the tank every day raises the salinity to 10% to 38.5 parts per thousand, the elements are already out of ratio with sodium chloride too high and all the other elements spot on. So when I dilute the water back down to 35 parts per thousand by removing salt water and replacing it with fresh water, every element will now be 10% lower than it was. Calcium was 420, will now be 378. Calcium is easy to fix, but it's not easy to fix with all the minor trace elements. It actually compounds the fact that major, minor, and trace elements may not actually be managed all that well to begin with. The biggest issue here is the chemistry balance only gets worse with every year that the tank is up. So why is this not a bigger issue? Well, I believe it likely is a bigger issue than most people realize and mostly just ignored. Simple fact is if you've been doing something seemingly successfully for 2 years, it's difficult to believe that it's the cause of today's tank issues, periodic unexplained mortalities, or sometimes even just a leap forward to evolutionary results. To be frank, a couple decades ago, getting past that first year of reefing was a major challenge for the average reefer. However, that's largely been solved. The water chemistry solutions, available information, and related equipment have dramatically reduced the type of major chemistry errors which show up in that first 12 to 24 months. The evolution going on now is eliminating the type of smaller chemistry errors that have a quiet but cumulative effect over many years. The goal is to make the 3 to 10 year chemistry challenges no longer an issue as well, and it doesn't have to be expensive or complex to be effective. Recent years have removed the cloud and guessing from this as well with ICP testing, which will tell you definitively if this is a trending issue in your tank or chemistry is grossly off track. Send a couple vials of water to Triton or similar reefing ICP company and look specifically for both elevated sodium and chloride levels coupled with large swaths of depleted elements. You can use this information to decide for yourself if you believe it's worth fixing. These are my 3 preferred methods of avoiding the elevated sodium chloride, salinity, and longer-term chemistry imbalances in order of a balance of cost and complexity. The first is up your water change game. Water changes in dilution with freshly mixed salt water is one of the easiest and most effective solutions to avoiding long-term chemistry issues. An extra bucket of salt a year is one of the lower cost methods, and once a year stringing together 4 25% weekly water changes for a month, which will turn almost 70% of the water, mitigating the progression of smaller issues and larger chemistry missteps as well. Avoiding negative results by default, these large changes should match temperature, calcium, and alkalinity of the tank. Similar effect can be achieved a bit more stably with a stronger approach to regular water changes as well, 10% weekly, 20% every other week, or 35% once a month, which turns over about the same amount of water each month, whichever you find easier to perform. This type of cumulative 35% water changes monthly schedule, minimizing the immediate and cumulative effects of all kinds of chemistry missteps or less than ideal dosing solutions. The second method of mitigating the sodium chloride elevation is two-part, using a two-part that directly addresses the increased salinity and related chemistry imbalances. The most time-tested and respected probably being Tropic Marin's Balling method. In Randy's Investigates, it also ended up being one of the lowest cost two-parts out there as well. The Balling method has 3 parts. The alkalinity is predominantly sodium bicarbonate, calcium is calcium chloride, and part 3 is what they call sodium chloride-free salt. That third part, or part C, is basically just their salt bucket mix without the sodium chloride, calcium, or alkalinity. Net effect here is once the calcium chloride and sodium bicarbonate are added to the tank, that leftover sodium chloride balances out with part C to basically make complete salt water. So when the salinity eventually rises and you have to dilute the tank water, by removing some salt water and replacing it with fresh water, the drop is done uniformly without creating brand new major imbalances. Well, no solution is absolutely perfect. This is going to mitigate many of the longer term imbalances, does it affordably and easily. In fact, it's becoming increasingly popular to do with the BRS Bulk Pharma Tropic Marine Balling Hybrid Method, which is just BRS calcium and alkalinity with their part C, which is around $16 and can make as much as 20 gallons of their part C, likely just $1 or $2 a month, to transition from a good approach to a great one. We'll have a video out shortly which has the exact directions on how to mix this and use the hybrid method. The third option here is yet a totally different approach, and that's a Triton Method Core 7 4-part and the most costly. Most of you know that the Triton Method is based on limited water changes, but also uses a chloride-based, calcium and sodium-based alkalinity additive. So how can that work long term? Well, they say they've designed it to work with excess sodium chloride in mind, suggest running a wet skimmer to remove some of the salt water daily and an auto top-off to automatically replace it with fresh water. If your specific skimmer doesn't keep up, then manually remove some of the water periodically and let the ATO replace it with fresh water. They share all of the elements in the four-part are designed specifically for this, particularly in a minimal water change environment. Probably more importantly, this method relies on ICP testing to demonstrate that it's actually delivering on that promise. I think it's important to note here that if you do water changes or don't have a refugium, the Triton other methods is probably a better formulation for you. If you're going to use the Triton method, hamsesreef.com has a cool calculator which tells you the net effect of the skimmer removing saltwater and ATO replacing it with fresh water. This is also where you can find the calculator I mentioned for saltwater dilution, effective water changes, and two-part imbalance calculator, all very cool tools. For those looking for my own personal recommendation, I believe one of the water change solutions coupled with Tropic Marin's balling or BRS hybrid approach is affordable and easy to implement solution to today's challenges. But there is a second challenge with sodium chloride that has nothing to do with two-part, something that I experienced for years myself without knowing it, and there's an easy solution for as well. It's less about the elements themselves and more about what comes along with it. Since sodium chloride makes up around 86% of the bucket of salt, the source of sodium chloride is probably the single biggest determining factor in the overall impurity content of the reef salt mix. So for this conversation, I'm going to use salt mix and sodium chloride almost interchangeably because while the salt bucket might have a fish on the front, making it seem magical, a vast majority of your salt bucket is just sodium chloride. Some salt mixes might include more trace elements or have a better method of mixing or incorporating them homogeneously, but how the sodium chloride is obtained is the #1 source of impurities and likely the single biggest quality differentiator. Impurities in the sodium chloride are almost certainly the primary or direct cause of the brown crust or surface films that form in your salt bucket, and it's absolutely unavoidable. No one really knows what's in that brown crud or film, and it's likely different based on each salt. I think we can all agree that it's undesirable, but in a vast majority of cases also does not seem to be preventative to success either. So in that spirit, I believe basically any popular salt out there that matches your desired parameters is likely capable of that baseline goal, a healthy reef tank, and I'd characterize most of them as good options. So what's the progress left on the table, or great in this case? Some salts certainly do seem to produce more consistent results than others, with fewer complaints, but past all those anecdotal reports, I believe great means less work, less risk, and incremental results with the fish and corals. I'm going to share some precise methods to achieve those goals in just a moment. Less work meaning your storage pump and equipment don't need to be cleaned frequently. Less risk meaning reducing long-term impurity risks, and incremental results with fish and corals meaning at minimum a reduction in unexplained mortalities, but potentially other health benefits as well. To understand how any of that can be achieved, it's important to know where the sodium chloride comes from. Sodium chloride is predominantly produced by using one of three methods: mining salt deposits from the ground, either by blasting it apart in underground rooms and conveying the rock salt out, or pouring water into deep salt wells and dissolving it and pumping it out, as well as evaporating seawater, often in outdoor solar evaporation ponds, or as a byproduct of desalination plants. There's obvious contamination concerns for all these natural sources, and they need to be refined to some degree to remove undesirable impurities. That refining process cost can easily be multiples of the source material and has a direct impact on the cost of the salt bucket. Historically, the primary pressure has actually been to do as little as possible to keep the retail price low. The lowest cost methods often using minimal processing, but finding mines that have pockets with naturally lower impurities and or adding chelating agents to the salt mixes to bind up the undesirable metals and impurities, so they're still in there when you mix up your salt water, they're just not biologically available. My experience in the industry tells me this approach is often good enough to produce a stable reef tank, but the impurities in the sodium chloride produced this way can often be seen with the naked eye, and there's always that managed risk of an unlucky vein of impurities in the source materials that periodic quality testing misses or simply isn't tested for. A seemingly rare event, but impurities in source materials are one of the more obvious, potential legit explanations for the otherwise unexplained periodic reports of a specific batch of salt harming clusters of tanks within a reef club, region, or nationally. Because reefers are more aware of these challenges now, a different approach or priority is gaining popularity in recent years using higher grades of sodium chloride, which have been refined to greater degrees like pharmaceutical grade material. Rather than relying on testing and catching, Most of these methods basically assume the material has an array of impurities and refines them to meet standards defined within the various grades, a process that doesn't just reduce or nearly eliminate the contaminants listed in the grade, but by default, a whole list of undesirables as well. The grade process independently ensures the facility, raw materials, process, and end chemical is suitable for the application. Net result is a refined graded sodium chloride often eliminates the need for chelators, the brown crud in the salt, and dramatically reduces the risk of undesirable element spikes that may come with the primary element in your salt bucket, sodium chloride. Refining processes with clear standards that are independently verified is what great looks like, and there are legit benefits that can be seen with the naked eye, potentially much more, and there's some simple, low-cost solutions to all of this that I'm about to share. First and lowest cost is if your primary concern is just keeping the salt bin clean and avoiding dosing that brown crud to the tank, specifically not accidentally dosing concentrations as it builds up after many batches. Something like a small CJ pump and a filter sock in your salt bin can go a long way, but even better, a BRS reactor with a sediment filter like the 5-micron RO-Save.Z will have a higher upfront cost but last a long time and a more complete solution for removing undesirable gunk from your salt mix. Second is the use of synthetic salt mixes. Synthetic salts are based on sodium chloride as well, but rather than mined or evaporated, the sodium chloride is produced chemically and often has fewer impurities because of that. Not as pure as some of the higher graded materials, but often a good middle ground of price and quality. HW Reefer is a good example of a globally popular synthetic salt. I'm going to say the third option is pretty obvious. Avoid all the impurities from the start with salt mixes that clearly state the grade of materials used. Tropic Marin salt with clearly labeled pharmaceutical grade ingredients being by far the most popular option on the market. Beyond the label, Tropic Marin's Pro Reef also had by far the best overall performance of any of the salts in all of Randy's BRStv investigates, ranging from mixing time, clarity, precipitation, stratification, ICP, and storage stability in a whole variety of environments. I presented the graded material last because it's the most expensive prolonged cost with the buckets around $100, but the reality is the bucket lasts 2 to 4 months for most people, so it's likely only $5 to $10 more a month than most popular options. One of the rare instances in reefing where you get to use the best available option without really breaking the bank. I can tell you that sodium chloride, buildup, and effect on salinity, overall chemistry were just not on the top of my list of concerns for most of my reefing journey. But once I fully understood the challenge and ease of solving them, it's hard to unknow what I was doing was just a good enough mentality, some of which is spurred on by the results of the tanks here at the office, the E170, which is doing so well on the BRS Tropic Marin Part C hybrid method, and all the tanks here run Tropic Marin Pro, many of which on auto water changes. So what about the next level information on other major elements like magnesium, potassium, sulfur, and calcium? That's all coming up right here in our Master Reef Tank Chemistry playlist, the BRStv channel homepage, and all our Master series right here.